You're gone. You're recording.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I'm really excited for organizing what is now our second Friends Along the Way. The short version of it is that I realize that people power is the most important thing of all of my experiences of the struggle for justice in Islam. And over the course of nearly 50 years in that struggle, I have met some of the most amazing people. And they span quite a breadth generationally. And it's important in terms of our theme on Islamic feminism to understand what it is to experience feminisms and or womanism in the context of different locations. Today we have 4 speakers, 4 amazing women, all hijabi by choice. I want to put that in there because they are also 4 women who live daily with the context of Islamophobia. This is really important because the topic of Islamic feminism has been shaped sometimes in contradistinction to other forms of feminism. And there have been people who have been reluctant to embrace the critical need for the intersectionality that these 4 women will bring to the table. And so keep in mind that as Muslim locations, and even in this meeting, are diverse, if you're living in a Muslim majority country, you're living in a place where Islam is a minority, that I intentionally identify these 4 women as coming from a place where Islamophobia is the norm. And that shapes their ability to achieve the success and the struggles that they have engaged in. And yet they do come from communities that have struggled for justice, sometimes not necessarily because of the reality of Islamophobia, but because of the reality of patriarchy. So I will introduce them one by one. I will go by age relatively, because between Malik and Jerusha, I'm not sure, but in any case, the first 2 will be on the North American side of the Atlantic, and the second 2 will be on the European side of the Atlantic. The first speaker is Deborah Majid. Deborah Majid is a professor emeritus of religious studies at Beloit College, a religious historian who makes the interconnection between religion, gender, and justice central to her life's work. She's the first African-American female and Muslim to be tenured at Beloit College and the first to be awarded emeritus status. Her contribution to social justice on the campus and in the wider community during her 21 years of teaching led the city of Beloit to claim January 21st, 2011, Dr. Deborah Majid Day. Dr. Deborah Majid received her doctorate in religious and theological studies from Northwestern University in 2001. Her groundbreaking publication, Polygyny: What It Means When African American Muslim Women Share Their Husbands, is part of her ongoing work with mosque communities for the cultivation of resources and support for healthy marriage, regardless of form. And just before we started, I was mentioning to Dr. Deborah that she's actually the only other African-American Muslim woman that I met coincidentally in other locations across the globe. I pretty much have been less in the US and more global. And so whenever I walk into a space and found her there, which has been more than once, I'm always so thrilled. So I am thrilled to introduce you to our audience, Deborah, please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. In the name of Allah, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. I am honored to be here at the behest of Dr. Wadu. I am honored in so many ways because I see you as a mentor, as a sister friend, as someone who makes Islam more challenging for me in wonderfully transformative ways. And it's a pleasure also for me to be here with all my sisters. I came to Muslim womanism through the doorway of Christianity as espoused by African American female scholars who organized their Womanist Approaches section as part of the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion. It was 1999, months after I had taken my Shahada and had begun to transition onto the Sirata al-Mustaqim, the straight path. From a lifetime as a conservative Christian and later a Christian minister who taught preaching both domestically and internationally while serving on the ministerial staff of United Methodist congregations. So sitting behind the late and awesome first generation womanist scholar, Katie Cannon, may Allah give her rest in peace, and listening to yet another womanist panel from the perspective of Christian women, I leaned over and whispered into Katie's ear, when are we going to hear from non-Christian women? When are we going to hear from Muslim women? So just as Waraka ibn Nawfal, the Christian relative of Khadijah, helped convince the prophet that he was indeed hearing Allah, may Allah be pleased with all of them, Katie Cannon challenged me to provide a concrete response to my own question. In other words, she said, well, Dr. Deborah, when are we? So that began a journey for me, a compulsion for me, some would say, so that in the next 2 years, I had organized a panel for the womanist section whereby the focus of each presentation was the embodied experience of Muslim women, particularly African American Muslim women, and this was a first for that academic audience. Let me also say, though, that we who are marginalized or in the minority, regardless of location, cannot and should not always highlight the need and then be responsible for meeting it. That kind of rejection simply leads to frustrations and is not healthy nor sustainable. That said, Katie was also pushing me to figure out for myself who I am and how I wanted myself to be represented. Indeed, that's the central womanist act, and it mirrors arguments that Amina often makes, and it is this. We, particularly Muslim women, need to participate in creating new notions of authority by the act of doing it. So this process of discovery led me to locate myself within an umbrella of woman-centered ways of knowing. And this you're hearing a bit of mine bias in this sense, in that I don't see feminism as the umbrella under which other women-led actions evolve. Rather, I see the umbrella as woman-centered ways of knowing, which houses various forms of feminism, womanism, and other frameworks. So from the start, feminism was never an option for me due to the term's historical and racist baggage, as least as played out in U.S. history, particularly in reference to the tendency of early carriers of the term to render invisible the labor of Black women while shying away from the racism they and their allies perpetrated upon Black women and men. More specifically, the suffrage movement of the 19th century, as others have written, acquiesced to white supremacy and sold out the interests of African American women when it became politically expedient to do so. In the end, for me, inserting Muslim or Islam in the mix was insufficient. My beingness had already been erased. Now, of course, this is just my experience. We will hear from other sisters, and we know other wonderful scholars for whom feminism works perfectly for them. And all I say is, alhamdulillah. We are free in Islam to choose our own ways of being defined. In contrast, for me, womanism, as framed by Alice Walker, spoke to my embodied experiences as an American of African ancestry. It is grounded in the lived experiences of of women of African ancestry, and as I develop Muslim womanism is framed in experience. I can't begin to tell you how many times I was admonished as a child to stop or to be silent or to move away from grown folks' conversations. In other words, I know what it means to be embodied for being womanist, for acting beyond one's age or one's place. So Muslim womanism for me is an epistemology, a way of knowing that positions the experiences and wisdom of African American and other women of color at the forefront of any consideration of Muslim family life or female activism. With it, I bring to a section of the Womanist House a lens that challenges totalitarian discourses of marriage, of partnering, household arrangements, family life in general, mosque decorum, and female activism. It draws upon the multiple interlocking experiences of African American and other Muslim women of color. That is, Muslim womanism offers means to foster knowledge about African American Muslim women based upon the views and voices of these female followers of Islam. Now, we were asked also to mention a couple of challenges that we have experienced, and I will share this quick story. I had gotten married. This is about 2003, actually. I had been married and I was coming to my husband's mosque. This was a new mosque for me. And when I walked into the door, it was for Talim. Now, I recognized that in the communities associated with Imam W.D. Muhammad, may Allah give him rest and peace and forgive his sins in the highest places in paradise. In his association, it is common for both women and men to share the same large masala space for Juma. It is how they negotiate space or construct their divisions or gender modesty within the mosque for other events varies depending upon the community. This particular community, I walk in and the men are seated in chairs in the front and the women are seated in chairs in the back. And we are with all of the children. So after, a few weeks of this, I'm discovering how much I am uncomfortable because I can't hear the speaker and I can't focus because of the children on the floor playing. Women, we know what it means to have to negotiate that kind of space. Anyway, I went out to the imam and I said, do women have an equal access to knowledge in this masjid? And he looked at me kind of funny and he said, well, of course, Sister Deborah. I said, well, we're not showing it. And so I explained what I meant. And he said, well, let's try an experiment. Let's divide the space rather than having men seated in the front and women seated in the back. Let's divide the space in half. And women had the chairs flow back and front. So both women and men have equal access to knowledge and also equal access to caring for and hearing the children. So that became a way for me to, it became a way for me to take seriously my responsibility to make both my celebrations, the ways in which I found benefits in a mosque known, but also to share my discomforts and to stand up for myself and for other sisters who have acquiesced to practices that are dehumanizing for us. I would end with this, and that is most of my work is often judged as either feminist and therefore anti-male and anti-community, and we can talk about that, and or my activism is sometimes viewed as un-Islamic. So when I organized recently Muslim Community Mothers Stand of Solidarity in Charlotte, North Carolina, in which 40 Muslim women stood with signs on the street, on the main thoroughfare in front of our masjid and talked about the deaths that have been percolating in our minds for several weeks now, and also the injustices, the murders committed by some police officers and vigilantes and others, and just anti-Blackness in general. That activity, except for some, was seen as un-Islamic and an act of politics that Muslim women should not engage. So I will end there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deborah. We will return. Also, if you have questions specifically for Dr. Deborah and you put them in the chat, we can bring them back when we have the discussion section. Next, I want to introduce from the same side of the Atlantic, Dr. Jerusha Tanner Rhodes. She is a Muslima, theologian, scholar, and public educator. She's Associate Professor of Islam and Interreligious Engagement and Director of the Islam, Social Justice, and Interreligious Engagement Program at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Her work and writing focuses on Islamic feminism, interreligious engagement, religious pluralism, and social justice. She is the author of Never Wholly Other, a Muslima theology of religious pluralism, and of the book Divine Words, Female Voices, Muslima Explorations in Comparative Feminist Theology, both from Oxford University Press. And you can visit her at www.jerushatannerrhodes.com. And my little snippet is I was introduced to her by her work. And the first book, Never Wholly Other, W-H-O-L-L-Y, was one of the first times that I saw a serious engagement with the work that I had done on Quran and Woman in the context of interreligious discourse. Her second book, coincidentally, challenges it from just dialogue to transformation. And I hope she will speak on that, and also the Islam and Social Justice Engagement Program. Dr. Jerusha, you have the floor.
Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you all at a distance. It's a pleasure to see anyone. As Dr. Amina mentioned, I am in New York City, and while we are going down rapidly in numbers, we have been in very devastating circumstances, especially for those of us in our city who bear the brunt racially, socioeconomically, and in many other ways. So it's nice to see people. I'll say that. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and be in conversation with you all. I'm humbled by it. I look at the people who are on the screen and think many of you have much more to offer than I do to this conversation. But I will add a few things and hope to learn many things from our time together. I think it's always great to start with context. As mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit, and I work out of and only claim to work out of my particular context, which is the US context, which is the Northeast and New York City. So a very urban context as well. I teach at a non-denominational but Christian historically seminary, which factors into some of my work. It is a very, what we would call progressive seminary. We can explain that, known for it's the birthplace of womanist ethics. It is the birthplace of Black liberation theology. It is a birthplace of many of the liberative models out of Christian discourse. And perhaps something that I should share with you all is that one of the reasons why I ended up here is because I wanted to be in conversation with the roots and the branches of other people who were crafting these liberative discourses in conversation with their own tradition, in deep and critical conversation. Now, of course, I need my Islamic studies conversations as well, too, and we'll get into the tensions there. a few other things about this context, as Dr. Amina already mentioned, this is a context of Islamophobia. And so in the US context, no matter how progressive or liberal you get, it's still a context in which Islamophobia circulates. And so to pick up on what Dr. Deborah said a little bit about just where she ended, this tension between how things are labeled. So your feminism can be dismissed and your Islam can be dismissed, and it's somewhat of a crucible. And so Islamophobia factors into that in a really unique way, because often, whether it's Islamic womanism or Muslim theology or Islamic feminists, or even just critiques of the tradition by people who still identify with the tradition and love the tradition and claim the tradition, we are often, people attempt to use our work as ammunition against Islam in an Islamophobic way. So, oh, see, this prominent scholar, we'll use Amina as an example. Amina Wadud says that there's this problem with Islam. See, we always told you Islam was problematic. And so there's this, as we all know, probably that's not news to anyone. I just want to say that it's very much a present piece of the context in which I work. I also want to say that there's another facet of this, and that's that there's just such uber minimal knowledge or understanding or experience of Islam. And so that's another thing. Of course, that's not true in Muslim communities in New York, but just in the general population, people have such a low level understanding. And that's true in general population, but it's also true among people who study religion, right? It's also true among people who are religiously devoted. It's also true among people who are chasing down and fighting after social justice causes, propelled and impelled by their religious convictions. They still may know nothing about Islam. Mm-hmm. So it's this twofold context of Islamophobia, but also minimal knowledge of Islam. I am a professor. I do a lot of public education in interreligious contexts. I also do a lot of writing. I think this is probably obvious, but I do want to say it about the context, is that being in the US and in a Muslim minority context, a lot of the work that I'm doing or things that I'm interested in, they're not related to legal codes or family codes. It's more community sentiment or community patterns or the way the community functions and thinks about things. It's not actually legal reform here in this context, because that's not what's in play, unless it's US legal reform. That's a whole different topic. And that does come with it. As for myself a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about how I came to this work. I did not come from a religious background, but I tend to chase down things I don't understand. It's a personality disposition. So if a question grates on me, I tend to not turn away and go away. I tend to turn toward and try to figure out the puzzle. And so religion in general was that puzzle for me, and Islam became the big puzzle for me. But then it became something that grabbed me and became part of my life in my late teens. A lot of that experiential grabbing by Islam took place in the context of Ghana in West Africa. And I think that's really important, because that really shaped so much of my formative lenses on what Islam looked like, practiced, were shaped by my experience there in those communities and in my family there and things of that sort. And so just, it's an important lens on some of the things I do. One of the things that stood out for me there was that my experience with gender, and as Dr. Deborah was speaking about where bodies are in certain spaces and how bodies interact and what bodies wear and what is seen as proper Islamic behavior, was very much shaped by that context. And it's not a context where male-female interaction is seen as, oh my gosh, subhanAllah, what is going on? It's not that context at all. And so being a white American, Northeast born and raised liberal New Englander, formed early on in Islam in this Ghana context, I would have some learning to do later when I entered contexts in which people wouldn't even say assalamu alaikum to you because you appeared to be female. Let me say something very, it's like very personal, but I think it underlies much of the work, which you can read in the books, but this is not in the book. I, however, did not think that I was automatically right in my feelings. And this has become one of the obsessions of my work. I believe that Islam and Islamic traditions form people, they make people, they polish us and improve us. And because I take that very seriously, I wasn't just stepping in and saying, I know, because I feel uncomfortable, therefore that's true. So much of my work and work in community, work in writing, work in the classroom is to hold this delicate balance between, this makes me feel uncomfortable. Is that a legitimate feeling? And how do I discern that? And part of that discerning is exegetical. A lot of my work is Quranic exegesis. But part of that discerning is ritual. It's ibadat. It's engaging and listening, feeling. And so one of the things that underscores a lot of what I'm interested in with concerns around gender equality and sexual difference, but also all of the other interrelated intersectional causes that anyone, I think, who identifies as a feminist, womanist, Muslim theologian or thinker has to be concerned with, all of these social disparities, marginalizations, is how do we listen to our experience and listen to tradition and be open to revelation and be in this perpetual conversation and state of listening, especially when there's so much noise around us. Noise of Islamophobia, noise of people who would like to hold us up as like, see, this is the one good Muslim, right? I mean, that's a challenge to the nafs, right? It's a challenge to the nafs, like, oh, I want to be the good Muslim, maybe. I mean, I don't ever want to be. I mean, I've tried to lay down certain ethical norms for myself. When someone's like, this is the good one, I'm like, okay, run for the hills. It's like the number one bell. I'm because of the power dynamics. And so just to underscore that that is something that drives a lot of my work. A little bit more specifically, what am I interested in? I am at a baseline interested in the value we assign to human difference and how do we get there mentally. And so I'm interested in what the tradition has to say about different religions, or people who don't practice religion, or people who practice multiple religions, because that's a form of human difference. I'm interested in gender identities and how we assign difference to those, and where do we learn that, and how do we construct that, and how do we, perhaps most importantly, uphold those understandings and perpetuate them on the backs and skins and bodies of other people. But my fascination goes across all of these categories. In most of my writing, I write at this intersection, and I think this is probably what Amina invited me today, perhaps, is I want to know what Islamic feminism or womanism or Muslim women's interpretation of the Quran, what those discussions, those interpretations, what they could teach us if we applied them to the topic of religious diversity. Because, I mean, follow the lead here. It's not an easy transfer. It's that Muslim women interpreters of the Quran, Islamic feminists, womanists, have a lot to say about one genre of human difference. And one of the things they say is, don't append those evaluations in a binary fixed fashion, hierarchy. What would happen if we applied that to our understandings of religious diversity? Now, here's the great irony. Let me just let you down the backstory. The backstory is there's a lot of Islamic feminists, womanists, others who talk about religious diversity, and they're happy to go to hierarchy. They're happy to be like, Islam is the best. We're on the top of the hierarchy. Everybody else is wrong. And so I developed this fascination to say, well, what if we took some of these ideas, Amina's work, Asma Barlas's work, other people's work, and I'm working in that context, that's why I'm citing those people, but there's many more. And we tried to apply it to that topic. What might we learn? And so that's what I wrote about in my first book. But I'm equally fascinated by the inverse, which is that what might we learn from listening to other, primarily in my work, religious feminists, womanists, mujeristas, Asian feminist theologians? What might we, as people who are interested in Islam and gender equality and sexuality and all of these kind of things, what might we learn if we listened carefully to those conversations that would help us in our own work? Now, let me just connect some dots here. Well, you might say, well, why would you even want to do that? Part of the reason why I want to do that is context. I'm in an interreligious context. There's no conversation I have that is not going to be in some way informed by interreligious dynamics. Even if I'm talking to other Muslim women about stuff that we want to do, there's still the backstory of Islamophobia, of little knowledge of Islam, of Christian supremacy, right? And so that is my context. But there's something more than it just being the context. One of the, I would say, most problematic byproducts of the tensions that Dr. Deborah was talking about, it's not Islamic to go, for Black women to go protest the killing of Black men by police. That's not Islamic, so we'll get rid of that, right? But it's not feminist enough to do this. You know, that one of the unfortunate byproducts of that is that, and this is just my humble opinion, not so humble, I actually wrote it in words that will be in the world for a long time, so we'll see. One of the unfortunate byproducts of that, and I used to do it, so I will just use myself as the example, is that we start to agree to play the game according to what someone else has set. And what does that mean? It means I don't call my work feminist. Islam doesn't need any feminism. It's fine how it is. It has everything inside, nothing is needed from the outside. Because the second we step outside, it's like we're admitting that we might have something to learn. Now look, I think Islam is beautiful and replete and diverse and sustaining and all of that. And I also think it's always and ever been in conversation with everything around. So who got to decide the rule of the game that said, if I talk to someone else, I'm no longer Islamic enough? I'm just a liberal feminist from the US. Who decided that rule? And more importantly, why do they want to enforce it so badly? And so in my second book, this is what I chased down. And here's one of the things that we find. There are a whole bunch of transformation causing, world shaking, ground shifting, hegemonic feminist critiquing religious feminists, womanists, mujeristas in other traditions that would be very good conversation partners for us. Now look, let me be clear. That doesn't mean I'm going to go to a Christian womanist and say, as Dr. Deborah was saying, oh, what can you teach me because I'm lacking and I need you to tell me what to do. No. But I can go and listen to them and they might be asking questions that I've never asked before. Right? So look, you can see my video, right? I have this lamp here. This is me in my room without the lamp on. It's kind of sad. It's really sunny out. It's very sad, right? What if I have a conversation with someone who turns on this light for me? I'm still in my room, but I've seen something else. Now look, I may hear you talking about your tradition and I may say, that's really interesting, but it has nothing to learn from it. That's okay. That's part of the discernment process. But one of the things that fascinates me and propels my work is that there are things that I have to learn. So for instance, I'm just going to give one example and then I'm going to stop talking. And there's tons of other things I thought I would talk about, but maybe later. here's an example. Tracy West. I don't know if people know who Tracy West is, but Tracy West is a very prominent figure in Christian ethics. And you should read her work if you haven't. But one of the things she writes about is what happens racially and in terms of religious supremacy in ritual spaces. She writes about how it transforms, conforms, deforms our body based on what we do in the ritual space, and how those patterns are created and created and created, and almost the grooves worn into our body. And look, you might be like, oh, well, I could get there. I could learn that on my own. I'm not interested in the church setting. It's not my setting. I'm not interested in like the aspects of Christology that lead to that particular reality in her church communities. But what is very, very interesting to me is all the theory and thought, and let me say labor that she has done already to say that ritual is not just about gender segregation. It's not just about women wanting to be heard on the board. It's about embodiment and bodies and what happens, and that it deforms not only the people who are excluded, but it deforms people who are included in a particular repertoire, and also the people who conduct the repertoire. That is a fascinating thing if you bring that into conversations about what happens in our mosques. Just part of the conversation, like women aren't there, put women there. Okay, women are there, now it's done. Is it done? Is it done if my daughter rolls into a mosque and never ever hears a woman talk or recite the Quran or anything ever? Is it done? Because she's asking me in the subway on the way home where the women are. Her body is being formed, transformed in a particular way. So that's just an example of something that's very pressing in my work, is what we might strategically learn from each other. And then just one final thing. This kind of interreligious, intersectional work, however, requires us to actually learn about each other. We do some comparative interreligious stuff where we're like, I have the Bible and you have the Quran. No, it's not good enough. You have to actually commit to learning about other people on their own terms. And so no more, in my work, there's no Jesus discussion. I don't want to talk about the Muslim Jesus and Christian Jesus. I want to know what you think Jesus is for your particular form of Christianity and how that filters into other things. And how can that help me think about my own stuff? Maybe it can't, maybe it can, maybe it can open up a whole new dimension that I was never even thinking about. And so I'm going to stop talking there and look forward to conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jerusha. I would like to introduce Dr. Malika Hamidi. Dr. Malika holds a doctorate in sociology from, and you're going to help me with the pronunciation, École de, where are you?
Here. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, can you help me with the pronunciation of your school?
Yeah. École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. High School on Social Sciences in Paris.
And she's also an associate member of the Laboratoire.
Yeah. There is two research center, l'ASPAD in Senegal and the CADIS in Paris.
Okay. Thank you, Malika. She's also a specialist in Muslim feminism in Europe. She publishes at the edition, a book drawn from her doctoral thesis, which was entitled Muslim Feminism and Why Not? She also co-wrote Islamic Feminisms and contributed to many collective works. She will soon publish Muslim Women and Feminists, Decolonialization, Agency, and Depoliticization, and is currently supervising the first anthology on Afrofeminisms and Muslim feminisms, critical perspectives, issues, and practices, along with a number of other publications. She was also elected as the Global Goodwill Ambassador in 2019, is married and has 2 children. As I said, I met Dr. Malika before she was Dr. Malika, while she was working on her dissertation. One of my first encounters in the context of European Islamophobia was, being invited to speak, and at the same time, not really knowing the landscape. And it was really very helpful to have someone like Dr. Malika to help me to understand that what I was experiencing was in fact a form of Islamophobia, even though it differs in tenor in some ways from what happens in the United States. Her entire dissertation writing and publication and life work has been against the backdrop of European Islamophobia, and hopefully she will share some of that with us. Malika, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so honored and delighted to be part of this inspiring panel, international panel. I'm so happy to meet some of my sisters, and I feel so shy to have to speak in front of you and Professor Margot Badran, who are in fact, who have inspired me in terms of knowledge. And I just feel honored. So let me share some of my reflections on the issue. So to begin with, again, thank you to have also that common reflection on the issue of Islamic feminism, which is now a transnational movement. We met last year, 1 year ago in Fez, with Professor Margot Badran during an international symposium on Islamic feminism, which proved that we are facing a transnational movement of thought and action. And I really think that it's gonna be such a powerful movement, which is more and more inspiring Muslim women, and especially in the West and in France and Belgium. Due to that Islamophobic wave which is going through our European societies. And let me share with you just one element. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we have here in Brussels, in Belgium, the Constitutional Court, who has agreed on the fact that now high schools and universities can forbid the headscarf. Wow, this is really something. I mean, we were, personally, I'm down. Why? Because I wouldn't have thought that a country like Belgium would go beyond France. You know, even France hasn't gone too far. And now you have Belgium, who is focusing on on women, because high school and university, it's not the issue of saving young Muslim women. This is beyond that. This is really forbidding and focusing on women who have decided freely to wear the headscarf. So we're really facing what we call, you know, the politicization of the headscarf in Europe, to refer to the work of John Scott that you may know. So I will come up with a viewpoint as a scholar activist, and with my spiritual journey, which has politicized itself when France decided to ban the headscarf in school 60 years ago. So we faced a political instrumentalization of the issue of women in Islam to demonize Islam in the West. And at the same time, I discovered all the work of Amina Wadud, Margot Badran, Ziba Mir Hosseini, Rifat Hassan, all the scholar activists who focused on Islamic feminism, that of course you know. So it was so inspiring for me, and actually it's liberated me as well from that understanding that the Muslim community would offer me, saying that you as Muslim women, you have to stay within an Islamic framework and be please don't touch and don't try to propose or even to suggest a reinterpretation of the scriptural sources. So for me, it was such a liberation to discover that work, and it was the very beginning of a journey to try to spread that thought to my young sister. And this is when I decided, after a symposium at the UNESCO, which Margot Badran took part, I decided, and thanks to Alain Grèche, who is a famous journalist in France, who really advised me to work scientifically speaking on the issue of Islamic feminism. Before that, I was an activist, but he would say, try to work from a scientific viewpoint, just focus on a doctoral research project to have a scientific voice, not only an activist voice. And it was the very beginning of a process in my mind, and from a political and academic viewpoint. So when we faced, that law which banned the headscarf, it was the very beginning, just the beginning of a Muslim feminist movement who organized their struggles in a human rights perspective first. And then it was through a feminist process alongside feminists from different backgrounds that we denounced, that anti-democratic law within the very first group of feminists from different backgrounds, which name is the Collectif des Féministes pour l'Égalité, the feminist group for equality, who struggled they were not struggling for the right of wearing the headscarf. They were not struggling for the headscarf. They were struggling for the right of doing what we want with our body. So they were in coherence with the main values of the mainstream feminist movement. And that movement of women was head by Christine Delphi. And Christine Delphi, she was a very close friend to Simone de Beauvoir. So it was really interesting to see that woman would denounce, alongside Muslim women, the right to do what we want with our own body. And by the way, the title of my book, A Muslim Feminism, Why Not?, was pronounced during a meeting by Christine Delphi. She said, I have to realize and to act the fact that now a link is made between Islam and feminism. But you just cannot imagine after that how she was marginalized in a country like France. Even her friends were telling her, what are you doing? You are opening roads to the Islamist women. What are you doing with partnership with those women? So for us, it was a symbol, a very close friend to Simone de Beauvoir, saying, now we have to act, that an Islamic feminist movement is emerging. But coming from her, for the young feminist women within the mainstream feminist movement, they were just shocked. It was just impossible that Christine Delphi was saying such a thing. So when we met with her, it was to me the beginning of partnership with non-Muslim feminists. So we partnered with egalitarian feminists, Marxist feminists, LGTB, etc., etc. We were focusing on a point, which was we do what we want with our own body. So it was the main objective, and it was for the Muslim women the beginning of a movement of thought and action. But at that time, for some of us, it was difficult to take part to that movement because of the connotation of the term feminism, which was linked to colonialism for some Muslim women in France and in Belgium. So we had to face three main challenges. From within our community of faith, we have to denounce all the cultural practices which have nothing to do with the religion, forced marriages, honor killings, by promoting by the promotion of Islamic women figure who took part to the rise of Islam, who were promoting education, etc., etc. So there was a reappropriation of the religious debate, but it was within our own community of faith. This is the very beginning of that work. And then in the civil society, we had to struggle against all the discrimination which is linked to the sexual, racial, and religious belonging. So we had the feeling to be considered as a second-class citizen because we were victims of social and political discriminations. And it was through our religious belonging, it was through our memory that we were claiming for justice and right. And now what we are facing is just, you know, that feminist or feminine discourse, which is supposed to be universal, but which is still considering Muslim women like the other. And today, there is really a relationship of domination between white women and Muslim or African women, etc., etc. And there is the willing from the Muslim women to denounce that discourse, which is actually considering us like victims, totally unable to act for ourselves, with that colonial approach on the topic of Muslim women. So this is why now, as European Muslim feminists, we are calling for the decolonization of the feminist practice. But more than that, now we are calling for the decolonization of academia. We're asking and we're claiming for the decolonization of academia. Why? Because now, you know, we have that hybrid profile of Muslim women who have master, who have a PhD, but are still considered as activists. It's because they're coming up with a discourse from within, they're not recognized within the academia level. So in the French speaking part of Europe, this is really crucial to have now European Muslim women, wearing the headscarf or not, but being recognized as an academic. It's really crucial. And we are now more and more claiming for national and transnational coalition of feminists, activists, and thinkers struggling against all forms of discriminations, promoting a feminist solidarity, developing connections with feminists from different backgrounds, because our common aim is really to struggle for the rights of women, whatever our philosophy, religious, and social background is. So concludingly, what I would say is that, first of all, through our presence as feminists in the field, we are questioning the Western feminist movement today, like Black feminists question the American African feminist movement in the US, saying that if we have to struggle against all forms of discrimination as women, most Muslim women also have specific discrimination linked to the race and religion. And at last but not least, what am I now analyzing is that now we have a new version of Muslim women who are between 25 and 35, 40 years old. This is what I call a Muslim feminism 2.0. A Muslim feminism 2.0, which means that now that new generation of young Muslim women, they are not defining themselves with the adjective as Muslim feminist or Islamic feminist. They say we are feminists. They are going beyond that religious identity, not to divide and not to polarize the feminist movement, and they are reappropriating not only the religious scriptural sources, they are now reappropriating concepts like intersectionality, post-colonialism, etc., etc. And this is something which is new and that we are facing, and I really think that this is a very promising new generation beyond Islamic feminist women as activists and intellectuals.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malika. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing my niece, Ms. Sarah Marceau. She is a graduate of sciences at Strasbourg in European Studies and International Relations, and holds an MA in Development and Cooperation in the Middle East and North Africa from Institut des Studies Politiques of Lons, or something like that. Anyway, since 2015, she is a member of the global Muslim feminist movement, Musawa, and has been coordinating the activities of Musawa's knowledge building working group. As a part of these activities, Sarah co-authored Musawa's report called Women's Stories, Women's Lives, Male Authority in Muslim Context, and also Who Provides, Who Cares, Changing Dynamics in Muslim Families. I have known Sarah for the years that she's been involved with Musawa, and I think she's one of those Muslim Women 2.0 because she was born after the production of a certain amount of knowledge about the possibility of challenging the discourse that dominated Islamic traditions when that discourse was not equally inclusive. It's a marvelous thing to know someone who nevertheless, when she takes it upon herself to engage in this, brings fully herself to the table in body, form, and spirit. It is my distinct honor to call her my niece, and she has the floor.
Thank you very much, Angie Amina, for this very generous introduction. It's Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's a true pleasure to be here. And I want to thank you, Professor Amina, for organizing this fabulous series of talks. It's an honor to be invited to join this conversation. I feel like a baby activist here with this wonderful woman. Thank you, Deborah, Malika, and Jarusha for sharing your experiences and insights. I'm this Muslim feminist 2.0 that Malika was talking about. And I will share with you a little bit about my experiences and context. So my journey to feminism has been a long, evolving, transformative, but most of all organic process, and it's still ongoing. At first, it wasn't a relationship of love, rather a relationship of distrust and frustration. I'm born and grew up in France, which is not the best place to be confronted to inclusive and intersectional feminist spaces. So to give you a little bit of context, French Muslims, of course, are highly diverse. Most of us are descendants from immigrant populations or immigrants ourselves. Some of us are white converts, and some of us are also asylum seekers. And it's very important because the diversity of our context and our backgrounds in terms of race, class, and gender is what makes the French Muslimness very complex and hybrid. So before I have ever heard of the word intersectionality as an academic concept, I knew what it meant empirically because I was experiencing it. When you grow up in a minority context, and this is something we've shared, Malika, Jarusha, and Deborah, you learn from a very early age that you don't belong. You know when you go to class that the majority of your classmates are privileged, because they're white, because they live in high-class suburbs, because they celebrate Christmas or their mothers don't wear the hijab. And so from a very young age, you know you're different, you know that you don't belong. So before learning what feminism means, your lived reality is at the intersection of different dominations and different marginalizations. I like to remember a quote from Audre Lorde, who said, "There is nothing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issues lives." And I'd like to here take the opportunity to express how grateful I am to many great Black feminist figures like Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Kimberly Crenshaw, who really paved the way for us because they developed this concept that were key to put a name, to put a word on what we've been experiencing deep inside, such as the concept of intersectionality, for example, or tools like, creating Black-only spaces, Muslim-only spaces to navigate these issues. So if I get back to my journey, racism, Islamophobia, and sexism impacted my life choices and experiences as a woman. I started to wear the hijab at a very young age by choice. And at that time, wearing the hijab was very important for me because it came from a strong faith-based conviction that it was the right thing to do. Of course, my relationship to this, to the hijab evolved, and it's holding different meanings today. But wearing the hijab in France is a true challenge because you become a walking visible target in many spaces. And I'm not going to share the details of this here in the conversation today. But what was important is that during these years where wearing the hijab were challenging because I couldn't wear it in class in high school, but also while looking for a job, at that time, my main source of strength was my faith. It was my conviction that Allah was just and that Allah was on my side. And I think that this conviction really helped me to resist these oppressions. It was a time where I didn't think of myself as a feminist. I rejected this term because for me, feminism meant these white French women who were nurturing the same Islamophobic policies and laws that were against me. And I couldn't identify to a concept that was alienating. However, with time, you realize that your own fellows, your own brothers of faith, also impose on you their privilege. When you see that you're excluded from mosque spaces, that in certain mosques in France, when there is not enough room for Salat Jumu'ah, women are forbidden to attend the prayer. So there are many ways, and I'm sure all of you here attending have examples in which in Muslim spaces, as a woman, you get marginalized. And somehow, so you feel that your own brothers of faith are depriving you from your faith rights. And so the more I got rejected from the French public space, the more I couldn't stand the very same rejection from Muslim spaces. But it took me some time to accept that the sexism I faced was double-edged. And when I realized that this is where my quest for a more inclusive and more intersectional feminism started. And like Auntie Amina said, I was lucky enough to be growing in this age where you all have produced these wonderful publications and conceptual tools to unpack Islamic sources. So I've learned a lot from Amina Wadud before I met her, from Ziba Mir Husseini, and from Fatima Mernissi as well. And through them and thanks to them, I discovered that feminism could be plural, and there was something else than colonial white mainstream feminism. Fatima Mernissi, may she rest in peace, was critical because her writings were in French, first of all, because I was not as comfortable reading in English, and also because the way she writes really spoke to the heart. It speaks to the faith. Her book, Le Harem Politique, was really challenging, but at the same time it was soothing because it gave some responses. And then I came across your book, Auntie Amina, about women and the Quran, and this was really revolutionary because it opened so many possibilities in reading the Quran. And this is really a true gift for someone like me who had a complex relationship with the Quran. And so thanks to you, thanks to Fatima Mernissi, to Ziba and who's famous, who's Islam, who's feminism, I realized how feminism was a social construct, and then by being a social construct, it was necessarily influenced by intersecting factors. And this is the part of my journey when Allah blessed me with the most important gift in my life, Musawa. I learned about Musawa through the book Men in Charge. If you haven't read this book, I really advise you to do so. Professor Amina has a chapter in it, and many of other wonderful Islamic feminist scholars had written in it. And reading this book was really life transforming because for the first time, all my intersecting identities were reconciled. It was the first time I felt that my understanding, my experience of Allah, my experience of divine justice was shared by other women from different contexts, from different age. So this book really gave me the language, the reference, the verses, the hadith that spoke to what I was feeling deep inside me. Shortly after, by miracle, and I really believe this is a gift, again, sent by God, there was a job vacancy, and I applied, and alhamdulillah, I was selected for this job vacancy, and I started to work with the wonderful knowledge building working team, Mulki Al-Sharmani, Ziba Mir Husseini, and Jana Raminger. And I would never forget my first Musawa meeting. It was in Rabat, and I really felt like Alice in Wonderland. I was in this room full of Muslim women from different countries, from Malaysia, Indonesia, Gambia, Nigeria, Senegal, Egypt, Morocco, and from all generations. And I think that's really important because they were from different places, but also from different ages. And I never met these women before. Some of them I read, but I still felt at peace. I felt at home. And everything in this first meeting set the tone for the years that followed. Because since then I never left. For me, it's been a privilege to be growing in an environment like Musawa, because it truly embodies the feminist ethics of trust, solidarity, and care. I've been blessed in so many ways, but one of the biggest blessings is the ability to share this solidarity between sisters and to learn and to learn from and be supported by scholars and activists. I believe that one of the most powerful ways to challenge dominant sexist, racist forces is this transgenerational solidarity and mobilization of women. It's this generosity in sharing knowledge, generosity in sharing experience, but most of all, the compassionate and humble mentoring. The way I've been mentored and the way I've seen the scholars and activists we work with, mentoring the next generations is what makes us stronger. Another strength and that I've learned through Musawa is how it's bridging the lived realities with knowledge, how it's linking scholars and activists. And this is something that Musawa has done walking on the steps of the Malaysian NGO Sisters in Islam. And it's important because by doing so, it really leads us, it really empowers us to build and recognize our expertise, our lived experience, as legitimate knowledge. Because most of the time when you look at how knowledge is produced, how it is valued in the world, but also in feminist spaces, there are power dynamics at play. And this is something Malika has spoken to, is if you don't have a PhD or if you're not graduated from Al-Azhar, whatever you are sharing is not considered as legitimate or as worthy. And so something that has been produced by academia or by a university would be considered as legitimate regardless of whether it reflects the lived realities on the ground, but your own experience of it is not considered as legitimate. And this is really something that Musawa's challenging, and it is valuing the experience of women on the ground. So being involved in Musawa really gave me the tools, the concept, the language, but also the courage to speak and to claim authority in my own national context. So I couldn't keep these gems to myself. I needed to share them. I needed to implement them in my national context. And so when I came back to France, I was lucky to witness the emergence of new forms of feminist groups, of Black feminists, Islamic feminists, queer, women against police violence groups, and also to see that Muslim women in France started to mobilize by creating their own organizations, like Lalab, for example, or Interrajal, and also how they started to build alliances with other French decolonial and anti-racist groups. And I think that this combination between anti-racist, decolonial groups and feminist groups is really what helped us to reconcile all our different identities and issues. One of the main issues for us was not being silenced by men, but being silenced by white women. And this is something Malika has spoken to, is that we really had enough of being treated as second-class citizen. And what I've been witnessing in the past 5 years is, and I'm really glad to be able to see that, is that we are able to get together, to exchange about our experiences, and to speak against dominant discourses that are portraying us as obedient, submissive, and non-active. We became active agents. In this context, sharing initiatives, strategies, and experiences of Muslim women from other spaces, like from Indonesia, from Malaysia, and sharing concepts like, the Tawhidic paradigm from Amina Wadud in French spaces has been inspiring and really helpful, because when you grow up in a secular context in which talking about God, talking about the Quran is a no-go, is really something that is reserved to the mosque and reserved to male scholars. So being able to bring that into our activist spaces is really soothing and a relief, because you feel that your struggle for gender justice, your struggle for social justice can be reconciled with your faith, which for many of us has been our main source of resistance. And so to conclude, because we were also asked to share a little bit about our challenges, I mentioned Audre Lorde in the beginning about not living single issues lives. And that means also we don't have single challenges. There are many challenges, personal challenges, but also collective challenges all the way. It's a very difficult struggle when you are in a minority context, because you have many opposing camps. You have, you face the opposition and backlash from right-wing groups, from secular feminist groups, but also from within your community. And it is really hard to find the balance between these different forces. And so the difficulty of this struggle is that it is energy and time consuming to constantly justify yourself, constantly address the same questions. Can you be Muslim and feminist? Can you wear the hijab and be feminist? And so at some point it can be tiring, and it can even lead to burnout, to constantly bear the burden of doing this pedagogic work. Another challenge is that sometimes the intergenerational communication is not happening, and that's why I'm glad, Auntie Amina, you brought that there. But there are many spaces in which it is not happening, and this lack of communication is creating conflicts, especially when it comes to the issue of inclusivity. How do we make sure that within our own groups, within our own struggle for gender justice, we don't perpetuate the same oppressions, and we don't perpetuate homophobia, negrophobia? How do we make sure that we also check our own privileges and act upon them? So I think that's something that has been the most challenging in our activist spaces in France recently. Thank you.
Well, I am just double smitten, triple smitten, quadruple smitten again. I was already smitten by the four of you, and now I'm even more smitten. I have been watching the chat, and especially want to thank Dr. Deborah, because she's put some notes in there, a link to Tracy West, and also to the full title of the book, Men in Charge ? And then also thank you, Suri, for putting that in. We have one question in the chat. It is specifically for Dr. Deborah. And I wasn't clear, but I need to clarify here. If you do not wish for your name or your image to be in a recording that I will eventually post as public, then you can put a question in the chat and just write ANON, meaning anonymous, and I can read it out for you, or a comment. If, on the other hand, you are interested to participate in the conversation directly with our four speakers, please also indicate in the chat that you have a question, and I will share with you and you can ask directly. We're still a relatively closed group. It's either from my Patreon page or from the Musawa network. I'm not opening up to the general public. I'm not ready for trolls or other possibilities yet. So I'm keeping some kind of reign over how far these things go open. So at the moment, I can trust anyone to ask the question with respect. But at this point, before we go to the general gallery, I just wanted to, if any of you had a question or comment with regards to the presentations made by your sisters during the panel. Who wants to go first? All right, we're going to go to Malika. Do you have a comment for your sisters on the other side of the Atlantic?
Yes, actually, I think that the main paradigm that we are facing is the Islamophobic wave, and I have the feeling that the challenges seems to be actually the same. That we seem to face the main challenges, and what I want to share with you is the impact of what is happening in the United States. The impact of what is happening in the United States, in the European societies, and within the Muslim community. All those partnership and all those movements composed of Black feminist women, that coalition of thinkers and activists. I have the feeling that young European Muslim women and European Muslim feminists are looking towards the other part of the Atlantic to be inspired and to re-implement your action. So this is what I see beyond the fact that your work, your books have, of course, inspired us, and that we have translated your thoughts in the French language to be so that the young Muslim women can be inspired by your work. So this is what I see.
This is Ani. Can I share some thoughts about some of the content that was shared by our scholars? I'm here in Los Angeles.
Yes, I will open to the general gallery in just a minute. First, I'm trying to coordinate a conversation between the panelists. So I just wanted to see whether or not Jerusha or Deborah wants to respond to, yeah, Deborah looks like she's ready to respond to Malika's comment, and then maybe Jerusha can give us a comment.
I actually had a question for Malika and Sarah. First of all, Malika, I see, alhamdulillah, well, thank you for your comments, number one. And I think the idea of inspiration is twofold, that we are inspiring each other as we go along. And I wonder if you could speak to how you're personally responding to the oppression that is occurring for women who wear hijab, and you are deciding to wear hijab. So alhamdulillah for your decision, but can you say a little bit more of the consequences, your personal consequences that you encounter by doing so? And then Sarah, I was really interested in knowing how the women in your inner circle, how they inform or speak to or challenge your level of activism.
Ladies.
You go ahead, Sarah.
Sarah.
Please go ahead, Malika.
Okay. So, you know, as I'm wearing the headscarf like a fashion victim, you know, this is the headscarf of Brigitte Bardot. So, you know, some people sometimes are saying, are you wearing a headscarf? Is it a headscarf, what you are wearing? So this is, I'm joking, but this is the way some people are approaching me when they see me with my headscarf, because they say, you don't wear it like a conservative women. You know, people like to create typologies of headscarf. So I have a fashion victim headscarf, and I'm very happy. For me, this is really a spiritual way of wearing it, like Maria, or I want to appropriate my headscarf as I want. And this is a feminist choice. But for some Muslim women, it's not a headscarf. And from within my own community, sometimes some women are, this is a kind of oppression as well. We often speak about the oppression within the non-Muslim civil society, but who are facing oppression within our own community. So you have sometimes some Muslim women who are saying, you are not speaking on our behalf because you don't wear the headscarf like us, and you won't be marginalized or discriminated like us, and blah, blah, blah. And this is absolutely not true, because I'm facing also discriminations. But what I really try to do, you know, I often say that my spirituality politicized itself because of the law on the headscarf. But I would say that for the last years, for the last 2-3 years, my political journey has spiritualized itself. Do you follow me? I went from political activism to spirituality. I have my spirituality politicized itself, but now I have my political activism, which has spiritualized itself. Why? Because I realized that now, coming up with political arguments, domination between women, etc., is more and more dividing ourselves. I have now in front of me, you know, some women who are really against the headscarf, who really feel that who are oppressed, etc., etc. And when you come up and you try to share with them some spirituality, when you try to be universal with them, they understand that we share the same values, etc., and they fully accept you. Even the most Islamophobic women that I met in my journey, now they say, at the end of the day, your headscarf is, it's not an object of oppression. If it makes you a better human being, spiritually speaking, then we can share common struggles, common projects, etc., etc. So for the last few years, I have realized that when we come up with that discourse of domination, struggles, and it's counterproductive. It's a personal viewpoint. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm now, this is what I really feel, is that coming up with that, you know, and I really think that the French environment is really pushing us, you know, to be always with that discourse of domination and struggles, etc., etc. Now I really feel that it's time for us to come up to our interiority, to come up to spirituality, to shine. Do you understand what I mean? So now, you know, even when I come up within the EU institutions or international institutions, I don't care about what people think about my headscarf. Even in academia, I come up, I speak. If people like me, alhamdulillah. If they don't like me, alhamdulillah. I'm in peace and I want to be in peace with them. And I really think, I have the feeling that things are moving, things are changing, and that a new generation of women have understood that we are all human beings. We are women in faith, women with our own values, our femininity, our feminist characteristic. But at the end of the day, we are women, and we really have to agree on common projects and to share our values and to implement them at the grassroots level beyond that discourse of domination.
Given the laws in Brussels, do you face any consequences of, I mean, is there, can you get arrested? Can you, will you be fined in public for wearing hijab in public? And are there women who choose not to wear it, and talk about any mental or spiritual anguish that they encounter?
I don't understand what you mean. If we can, can you repeat that?
Yes. Given the laws in Brussels that are against wearing hijab, do you face any concrete consequences? I mean, can you be fined? What will happen to you if you're,
You can be fined if you wear the niqab. Okay, so Belgium was the very first country who voted a law against the niqab. But now, you know, with the mask, with the COVID, we are facing a big problem. As to the law, which has been the last decision of the Constitutional Court, we are struggling it. I've just finished this afternoon an article which might be published in the mainstream media to denounce actually that law, and we're organizing a big demonstration on the 5th of July. So we are not going to accept that law. We're going to struggle against that law. So for the first time, what is happening is that the Muslim feminist group, the Muslim people are going to get to have partnership with human rights organization, with non-Muslim feminists, etc., to struggle. But we are not now. There is not a law who can punish you if you wear the headscarf in the street. No. It is just the niqab. You can be fine with the niqab, but now the big problem for us is that if they forbid the headscarf at the university, wow, this is a big challenge. I mean, for the first time in the history of feminism, you are going to violate the rights of education. So I really think that it's gonna be a big a big challenge, because I'm sure that if it happened in Brussels, if the law is voted, then be sure that other European countries are going to forbid the headscarf in university and in high schools.
Did we lose Sarah?
Yes. So to address, to add on your first question, Deborah, is one, I mean, it wouldn't be enough to actually enumerate the different challenges you face when you wear the hijab in France. I've been wearing it for 17 years, and you can't be fine, but when you go to school, high school, and also secondary school, you have to remove it each time you enter the space of the school, not even the building, but the portal. So there is a whole humiliation process in which you're tracked. You're tracked when you go outside with the school for school activities, school visits. Constantly, you're tracked by your teachers, by the administration. You're even tracked when you wear different kind of hijabs. So, for example, there was a series of ruling in which you're not allowed to wear a turban, you're not allowed to wear a bandana. At some point, some headmasters wanted to forbid wearing long skirts. So there has been a whole panel of very harassing policies. And yes, I know of many friends who dropped from school following this law, and it does have an impact on education. And in terms, it has an impact beyond education, because we know that even if in the labor space, in the labor market, there aren't laws for private companies that forbid the hijab. It is forbidden in all public services. So you can't be a teacher, you can't work in any administration, you can't even work in a mayor council or anything. And many private companies don't allow to wear it. So many women go through self-censorship, because they know they won't be able to find a job. So why do we bother studying? Why do we bother go through all these challenges? That said, another challenge is that it became the be-all and end-all of any discussion about Muslim women. And I think for my generation, this is also something that annoys us, is that whenever we talk about Muslim women in France, everything is about the hijab. And even for those of us who are who have faced this challenge and are suffering from it, I don't want to talk about that. I'm just really tired that whenever I'm interviewed, whenever I have to talk, whenever we organize something, even when we don't mention this issue at all, we want to talk about other issues. We want to talk about sexualities. We want to talk about work. We want to talk about other issues that young feminist women are tackling now: motherhood, planning, family planning. But we're not allowed to, because whenever a white woman will be entering the room, a white journalist, there is a hijab question. And I've ever had different experiences in which I specifically said, when I was interviewed, or I don't want to talk about the hijab, and the journalist would say, yeah, of course, you talk about whatever you want. And then she would come back, or he would come back to me and be like, please, can you address that? Because the audience, they want to know about that. So it's really tiring, and somehow it made it difficult for both. I mean, even when you want to, if at some time in your journey you want to take off the hijab, which is also a right, they made it even more difficult, because the French institution, the French racist system made it so sacralized that it made it even difficult for those who wanted to have a more flexible relationship with this dressing to go through this journey. So I think that's another nuanced challenge that is less direct, but this that we navigate even and that we are discussing in our Muslim feminist spaces. How can we get out from this trap? How can we get out from the way they define us and want to define the terms of the debate, and just take this debate out of their hands? And I think that's really a main challenge. And for your second question about the women in my inner spaces, I have different reactions. Many young women, younger than me or within my generations, react very well to my activism, and they've been very receptive to the work that we do in Musawa, to the knowledge we share, because to build on what Malika just said, it's true that Islamic feminism, there is a lot about it in English, but very seldom things in French. It's very recent that we have the material in French, and people, I mean, the majority of French Muslims don't speak fluently English. I couldn't read or speak fluently English 10 years ago. So we do have this obstacle of not having access to the knowledge that is produced outside, in the other side of the Atlantic. And I think that one of the main reasons also that we don't have that many production on Islamic feminism in French is because we're too busy working on responding to the hijabi debates. So whenever there is something that is going on, we're like, it's time and energy consuming. You have to fight, in this front, whether you're for it or against it, and then you don't have enough space, intellectual space, emotional space, to go and work on your sources, to go and work on tafsir and other things. So yeah, young generations are very receptive. They ask for more. They want to have access in English, in French, to this kind of knowledge, and this is one of the things I've been doing in my French activist space. Translate things like the Tawhidic paradigm from Auntie Amina, some of the works that we did in Musawa on the concept of Qawama, and so on. The other generation, the generation of my mother and my grandmother, it's a little bit more difficult, because then it's not the same debate. And also for some of them with whom I had the discussion, it's very difficult to grasp this concept and this language. And also because we have this weight of colonial, this colonial legacy in France. It's like, my grandmother doesn't read, doesn't speak French as well, and it's like, and my mother also didn't have the chance to have the education I have. So sometimes I feel like I can't expect from her the same intellectual effort than me, and so there are things that I would save her from, but there are other things that I'm going to share with her. So I think it's a different discussion, but I do believe that we need these intergenerational discussions. We need to have spaces in which we can have this intergenerational sharing of experiences, but this sharing of experience needs to be two ways. We need to also acknowledge what we can learn from them, because I do believe that even though they don't have the words, the words about feminism, intersectionality, they are feminist, and my feminism comes from what I've learned from my mother, from my aunts, from my grandmother, even though they didn't have the words for it. So I don't know if I'm addressing your question. It's very complex, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions that are generated in the chat, and I want to acknowledge them and let them come forward to ask for themselves. I had to cut Annie off, so I told her I would return to her first. She had a comment, and it's all about this conversation about the hijab anyway. But Saima had a question quite some time back. And then Suri and Farah have questions. So in that order, ladies, if you don't mind, could you address the panel, and that way we can kind of keep it going and I don't have to break in. Starting with Annie.
Thank you. This is such a treat for me sitting here in Los Angeles. For some of you who don't know me, my name is Annie Zonneveld. I'm originally from Malaysia, and I founded the organization Muslims for Progressive Values and a global inclusive Islam organization, human rights organization called Alliance of Inclusive Muslims. And I too am tired of the conversation on hijab. So thank you for that, Sarah. Now, I do want to, I do appreciate a lot of the comments, the thread that I'm hearing about being inclusive in when we challenge the conversations and the social justice issues within the Muslim community and outside the Muslim community, particularly from what Sarah was saying, and also from what Jerusha was saying as well, the discomfort, and for her to be brave enough to visit those discomforts. for someone that's been talking about for more than 13 years about Islamic feminism, and I just want to stress that because I do not wear a hijab in the Western context, it is very important for me to define myself as a Muslim feminist. And so, particularly with my last name being Zonneveld, for example. So most people don't think I'm a Muslim because I don't dress, quote unquote, Muslim, right? And so that's also, I want to inject that into the perspective of the conversations that we're having here, to be mindful of the Western context for American Muslims, such as myself. So for the 13 years, we've been talking about feminism, we've been talking about LGBT rights within the context of Islam, we've been talking about, and not just taking the example of Amina Wadud during her prayer, iconic moment in 2005, so iconic even that my 7-year-old daughter at that time looked at BBC and then turned to me and said, well, it's about time. And that was a cue for so many of us that gave us the permission. And so what we've done in the 13 years is to actually develop and nurture communities to actually promote the idea of Muslim women leading a co-ed congregation in prayer. So to address Deborah, it was fantastic for your husband's mosque and your mosque to actually to consider, oh, let's then try something new. That is such a conversation that does not happen in so many mosques in the United States. That the openness to reconsider even. And that was so refreshing for me to hear from you. I want to actually challenge, we've been challenging the issue on feminism, LGBT, marriage, Muslim women marrying non-Muslim men. We've been doing these interfaith marriages for more than 13 years. We've been marrying hundreds of couples this way, and it's still a contentious issue. And also, of course, racism. And so all these issues that we've been raising has been very discomforting for many Muslims in America, particularly. And what I also find that because of this discomfort that we raise in the social justice work that we do and the intersectionality of the work that we've been doing for 13 years, I find that MPV is often excluded from a lot of Muslim spaces because it is not comfortable for them. And because I don't wear a hijab, and many of us do not wear a hijab, I think there's also an exclusionary thinking because we don't wear a hijab, we're not Muslim enough. And I just want to, I want to point this out because the work that we've been doing is intersectional, and we do push back against Islamophobia. And I forget who it was that said that there's this being sandwiched between the Islamophobes using the work of our work of social justice, and Amina, I think somebody using the work that we're doing to see there is a problem with Islam, right? But it's not Islam, it's Muslims. And so I just wanted to thread all these different points together, and how this is so wonderful for me sitting here in LA. It's very lonely, and there's a lot of think tanks and institutions like Jerusha's doing is really remarkable work in the East Coast, and there's really not that much going on the West Coast. And if there is, it's very, very conservative. So thank you for the space and for listening to me. I really appreciate it.
Amina,
Saima, are you still here? Oh, Jerusha, you want to reply? Please, I'm sorry.
It's a response to Anya and also to some of the conversations about hijab, but one of my obsessions is about authority, and how do we construct authority, who has authority, sources, personal experience, communities, all of these kind of things. And I want to recognize the contextual difference in hijab wearing in the United States and hijab wearing in a place where there's actually legislation on the books that prohibits it. I mean, here we have contextual discrimination and prohibition and stereotypes and comments and yelling on the street and violence. We don't necessarily have the legalistic framework the same way. And I want to say that I remain highly suspicious when people keep saying, we need to be talking about this. I often think that that is the way that people control the story. And if you're challenging the power, but then letting people in power decide what you're going to talk about, we all need on this Zoom call to be talking about how we interrupt that. How do we refuse that? And in contexts where there's laws on the books prohibiting people and affecting them psychologically, spiritually, socially, socioeconomically, racially, we need to tackle those laws too. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be quietist on that. But also, what are our deliberate strategies to interrupt that cycle? I've been in settings where people ask me certain questions and literally I look at them like I don't understand the question anymore. That's become some of my go-to. Someone will be like, well, tell me about hijab. I'll be like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Explain to me what you're talking about. And the reason why I sometimes adopt that, and that's contextual, but sometimes adopt that stance is the second point I wanted to make. And that's that I think in my teaching in the classroom, but also in public, that it's so important to get some kind of root structure going. And I think that that's why Amina's work remains so transformational. I think all of us on this call would probably say the same thing and say, we meet someone every day who's like, I just read this great book, Quran and Woman. And we're all like scratching our head like it's been around. And it's transformed not just how someone thinks, but how someone lives, right? But I don't, just, you can ignore my comments here, but I think the reason why it does that is that it provided a foundation to think about a host of other topics. It didn't just provide the conclusion, it provided the roots out of which many things could grow. And so when it comes to Ani's point about intersectionality and Sarah talking about how certain topics are harder to talk with certain Muslims and other, and we all know that, and there's a comment in the chat about LGBTQIA rights and conversations and how tensive those can be. I guess my offering is that there's a difference between the positions we're going to take on those issues, and I'll fully disclose mine. I will always err on the side of inclusion of the marginalized. That is my ethical commitment. If I err, then I will err that way, not on the other side. That's just an ethical commitment. But there's always going to be a difference between our conclusions and the foundations out of which we think. So when I roll into a space and I say, we need to support the LGBTQI community, definitive, it's very different than saying, let's talk about what you think about human dignity in the Quran. And walking through well, if that then, and if that then, and if that then, this kind of process is an education process. And I know I'll like scream out like what I really am right now, but people need to learn those things, right? Access to resource and translations is one thing, but also to better understand the traditions of Islam remains fundamentally important. And I'm not talking about everyone getting a PhD or becoming an Al-Azhar graduate. I frankly don't believe that unless you have the right biology, no Al-Azhar degree will ever purchase authority. It just won't. We've tried that route. We learned that you can have all the muscles and all the things, but if you don't look a certain way, you will never embody the authority that people are expecting because it's patriarchy. It wants to be replicated. But I do think in a more vernacular sense that we need wider awareness of the tradition and the sources and the offerings so that people can come to conclusions on these intersectional issues.
We have 10 minutes, I'm sorry to say, and I just wanted to know if Saima, Suri, and Farah still want to make their interventions. If you could just all three make your points and then have the panel respond, and then we'll be closing.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Dr. Deborah, you touched upon something that I'm actually researching at the moment. The idea of praying side by side, women on one side of the prayer space and men on the other. This is something that I came across in my spiritual community and just saw it as common sense. But I'm doing some research and I'm looking for the sources to this. I keep coming across a lot of people that say that this was what it was like in the Prophet's mosque in Medina. And that there are sources that say this happened, but I can't find the actual sources. And I just wondered if anybody could direct me to anything
And what I actually was referring to was Talim, the lectures on Sunday afternoon. I wasn't talking about Salat, where women pray alongside the men, because in our masjid that does not happen. But the Talim, the lecture that is given, okay, you can have that kind of situation. Now, I believe, Amina, I could be wrong, but haven't you written, or maybe it was Amina McLeod, our other wonderful sister, haven't you written on positions of prayer, particularly given your historic imam leadership?
The short answer is no. I'm not a historian. Sorry about that.
There's
But we do have historians in our gallery. I think I'm just going to make note of that as something to try to see if I can attach later to the recording to allow for. And then Ani is giving some resources in the chat for you, Seema, so you can look at those. But they're definitely resources. It's just that they're not the resources that I can pull off the top of my head. Suri.
I can go next. Thank you so much. I'm just going to make it quick. I'm an activist, a queer Muslim woman who works on both women's rights and family law reform, but also LGBTIQ rights, because that's part of who I am. But the issue of sexuality and LGBT rights is obviously still hugely contentious. I mean, I'm living in a majority Muslim context, but also in minority Muslim context, I can see how it's contentious on both sides and difficult to raise on both sides. And this is still even contentious among Muslim feminists who, I mean, in all other respects, I think are super progressive. But when it comes to LGBTIQ rights, I think there's suddenly a silencing on the issue. So how do you, as scholar, I know Jerusha, you spoke to it a little bit, but I'd be interested in hearing from the other panelists as well, how you as scholars and activists working from an intersectional lens then deal with the issue of LGBT rights in your context. How do you navigate that terrain, stay true and live that intersectionality in these difficult contexts? Thank you.
Who's going to respond first, please, from the panel?
I'll do it very quickly so that others will have a chance. I can honestly say, Suri, that I do it very gently. To be honest, this is not a conversation that is even on the margins of occurring in our association. Too often, these kind of conversations I will have outside of my mosque community, sometimes with other Muslims and sometimes with non-Muslims. When I brought the founder of Al-Fatiha to my college to extend to my students the reality that there is Muslim and Islam are not monolithic, I had someone question my faith simply because I sat in a car with someone who was not, for whom I wasn't married, and who is gay, and who I actually paid for him to come to the college, right? So I know now that these are kind of conversations that I kind of have special sections where I can do that, but I'm trying to deal with the issues that are most current in their minds first to make room for the more difficult conversations. But I'm not convinced that that level of thoughtfulness will occur in my context during my lifetime, to be honest.
And I already spoke about this, but I just want to add in more like on the ground. I mean, I agree in many ways with Dr. Deborah that, you know, people do not want to have these conversations. I don't, and so that's the reality. But at the same time, there's a whole contingency of Muslims who would love to have these conversations. And in some of the work that I've done with ISJI and the Muslim Women Leaders Program, a lot of, especially the younger generations, they're clear where they stand on this issue. What they're not clear on is how to do the work of unifying their commitments and their community connections and familial connections with the stance that seems very ethically clear to them, which is that they're in support of LGBTQI rights. And so it's the infrastructure building. Now, I don't think that work should be done superficially. I do think some places you can have these conversations, but I do want to go back to this roots comment I made before and say, look, when we function on the surface of like, we want women inclusion, we're missing the whole issue. Patriarchy isn't just about women. It's about gender and sexuality. And so it's inherently about all of this. And it's about power, and it's about money. And so and it's about, and by the way, someone before mentioned, Ani mentioned marrying Muslim women to Muslim men, another sensitive topic to many people. But do you know, if you go back into the tradition and read the legal explanations, that they are completely Islamic supremacist? They're about how nobody else in any other religious tradition could ever treat a woman as well as a Muslim man. I'm just going to bet that there's some women on this panel who think that Muslim men might need to do a little work on that topic. But so the reason why I'm giving that example is that like part of the work is like, we need to understand it's not just the issue on the surface, but if we peel back the face of it a little bit, we're going to start to see, oh God, it's not as simple as I thought. You know, men, like all the LGBTQI stuff is not so much about the hatred of gay people or like trans people. It's about men. It's about men and their menness and centering it. And so it's the same problem that women's rights activists have. And so it really behooves us to take a step back and look at that and understand that that's the work that needs to be done. And you can only do superficial work if you think it's not that deeper issue.
Well, I want to say that we could continue to go on forever and ever, but realistically, I think in my situation, because as I come up towards midnight, it's a lot clearer to me that I need to keep us to the time, and also because I want people to follow the recording, and they sort of lose attention after an hour, and we definitely have gone our full 2 hours. And I then want to just extend my gratitude to my sisters and niece, Doctors Deborah, Malika, Jerusha, and Sarah, for agreeing to participate as friends along the way. I also want to remind us that the struggle is real and that we're not done. And every time we have an opportunity to do, you know, exactly what Jerusha said in her comments, listen carefully and read carefully enough to be transformed ourselves, then in my perspective, we have a better chance at being better human beings. And ultimately, I think that's what Allah asks of us in the context of our being Muslim, that we be decent human beings. I apologize for the questions that I had wanted to acknowledge from the chat, but I'm the gatekeeper. I have to keep us in our time. Also, because this will be made available first on my Patreon page. I just want people to know, if you're interested, www.patreon.com, The Lady Imam. It's an exclusive space where I do a lot of things. And I'm going to share it with that group first, but in 1 week I will publish it on my YouTube channel, which is also The Lady Imam. So from The Lady Imam, can I just say thank you very much. May Allah bless you. Have a good day, night, evening, depending on where you are in the world. And I hope to see you again in this space. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everyone.
So much. That was great.
Thank you. Take care.
Assalamu alaikum.